In this episode, we discuss the antitrust move that the U.S. government's made against Apple and why this could signal that the U.S. may be getting its groove back as far as promoting business and competitive markets. And in part two, we'll get into why it's a good thing that some of the findings from the new James Webb Telescope are calling into question many of the things we think we know about how the universe works. Hello, welcome to the Call Like I See It podcast. I'm James Keys, and riding shotgun with me today is a man who, even as he's gotten older, has definitely kept a carefree demeanor. Tunde Ogunlana. Tunde, is this the part when you start calling out money ain't a thing?
No, it tells me you don't live in my house because my children probably wouldn't agree that I'm carefree. But I guess that's because I'm their dad. But I appreciate it. You make everyone else think I'm a fun guy, so that's good.
There you go. All right, we're recording this on March.
My dog thinks I'm cool, so that's.
Hey, there you go. There you go. That's all that matters.
Yeah. I wonder about the kids, though.
We're recording this on March 26, 2024. And Tunde, last week, the U.S. Department of Justice, along with several states, filed a huge antitrust lawsuit against Apple based on the belief that a lot of Apple's business practices are monopolistic and anti-competitive. Now, the action doesn't directly seek to break up Apple, at least at this point, but it is going after a lot of the practices, such as the way Apple does its messaging app or runs its app store or locks accessories in or out of its environment that the government thinks are stifling competition and really that Apple's using to try to drop the hammer on anybody who would want to compete with them. So what's your initial reaction to the antitrust move and also just what Apple's being accused of here?
I find it interesting because we haven't seen this type of move by the Justice Department, at least publicly in this way, to such a large corporation in a very long time. Just the fact that, Apple, along with companies that are referred to as the Magnificent Seven, used to be FANG, F-A-N-G, which used to stand for Facebook, Apple, Netflix, and Google. And now, if you add Tesla and NVIDIA, these companies have been really dominant over the last decade and combined now have a value of more than most countries. And so it's interesting as relates to the new technology and the speed at which the world has changed around these technologies. So if we think about 20 years ago was 2004, a lot of these companies, some existed, some didn't, but the ones that existed were much different than they are. I mean, think about Amazon back in 2004 was selling Kindles and was like an online bookstore primarily. Apple was making maybe the iPod, hadn't made the phone yet, still was making, MacBooks and more of a computer company as it used to be. And Facebook, I think, was just being founded that year. It was just barely getting off the ground. So, I think it speaks to the speed at which this technology and the information ecosystem took off and kind of the lagging behind of the regulatory environment to catch up and say, hey, you guys gobbled up a lot in the last 20 years and we gotta peel this back and make sure that you're not behaving in a way that stifles everyone else coming up after you.
And we'll get into it later, but like the U.S. government had been, starting in the 80s, had taken a much more hands-off approach towards antitrust. I mean, many said that they just stopped enforcing antitrust for the most part. And so, that's a part of it as well, just in terms of whether or not this may be a signal that, hey, maybe we're going to start looking more seriously at antitrust because there's been a lot of consolidation and a lot of, we're in a world with a few dominant players in many, if not most industries, which is not necessarily the way that you create a robust, competitive market that is good for business, all types of businesses of all size. But my reaction really is just more so that Apple's like a serial violator of this. Like Apple's whole get down seems to be kind of run afoul of the antitrust. I remember back, they had issues with, and states and the government had issues with the way Apple did the iPod. Even I'll go back then when it was like, okay, yeah, they only wanted you to be able to get songs from their, environment or whatever. Or even, the issue that they had when they were locked in with AT&T Mobility. And that was, and so we may or may not as consumers remember all of these things, but like I think the idea of how Apple was locked into AT&T for a while, and then what ended up coming out of that when the government and other people pushed back on that was that now, we can freely unlock our phones and take them around, but that wasn't always the case with cell phones. So, and I'm not going to point that all at Apple in terms of saying the whole industry seemed to like to make it so that we had our phones were locked to our provider. But nonetheless, like Apple's get down does seem to be one, like they seem to want to create a closed ecosystem and lock people into their ecosystem. Like that seems to be their goal. So that behavior is the kind of behavior that the government now, and we've seen when we'll talk about the EU, are saying like, you can't do that. Like that is monopolistic inherently. And that's the type of stuff that people use to stifle competition. Like it shouldn't be like, if you make a good product, then that's fine. But that doesn't mean that once somebody gets one thing of your product, that's all that they have to, in order to leverage that, they have to stay in your ecosystem the whole way. So I think that's the big picture issue, I think. And I hope that it comes to a head sooner rather than later, because Apple does, in my opinion, make good products and so forth. But the fundamental piece of what they're trying to do and saying, okay, well, you only can buy things through our app store. You only, if you're going to have an accessory, it's your Apple Watch will only work if you have an Apple phone. And like that type of mentality. It does, most of what we consider, industry doesn't work like that. Like if I buy, a Ford, I don't have to buy Ford tires, or, like I don't have to go put Ford gasoline in the car, or whatever, Ford oil in the car. Like it's they have a device that works with whatever is standard industry standards for that thing. So that's kind of the big fight. I think what we see now is kind of the surface skirmish on that, but that I think is ultimately what's going to be the big fight here. So that's my reaction. And I mean, I think that's going to be an interesting thing to unfold in this technological space, where it's very easy for all of these players to try to lock us in, but it's also very easy for them not to. Like, this isn't the same. They don't have to go retrofit a bunch of things in order to open up the environment, in the same way they didn't have to retrofit a bunch of things in order to make the phones able to be unlocked and used on different networks. But like they don't want to. It's easy for them to lock them all in too. So, like that was kind of my initial reaction. It's kind of the big fight that's coming as far as like this technology. Are they going to be allowed, or are companies going to be allowed to lock you into environments?
And I think you make a good point about the fact we can't see it, because I think if you think of traditional industry, quote unquote, and like industrial companies like steel companies and railroad companies, and the old idea of kind of monopolies, like the game, the guy with the top hat and the monocle. Those are we're used to kind of big industry where you can see stuff, right? Like you're saying about Ford. Well, if they forced us to buy gas from Ford gas stations, and they had Ford owned companies pulling oil out of the ground, and Ford ships shipping the oil to us, it would be easy to see, like for us, just as lay people and consumers, like, oh wow, this company Ford really is dominating everything. We can see it all over the place.
By the way, just real quick, companies would do that if they could. That's what they would love to be able to do that. That's kind of the standard oil story, which, like I said, we'll get into that. But like they want to, vertical integration, all that stuff. They want it, like if they can, like they'll continue to grow and try to do that. But go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the whole point of this discussion. But I wanted to read real quick from one of the articles citing exactly like what we're talking about here as to why. So it says the Justice Department said in a release that to keep consumers buying iPhones, Apple moved to block cross-platform messaging apps, limited third-party wallet and smartwatch capabilities, and disrupted non-app store programs and cloud streaming services. So that goes back to the point, like you had talked to me in a private conversation about the streaming services, that if Apple didn't approve or want you using certain vendors, they themselves would manipulate the device so that the streaming output was
they would lessen the quality, I think
lower quality.
We know that with Messenger, for example, like when people send through Messenger, send multimedia files, then they'll lower the quality if it's not coming from out within the Apple ecosystem or going out and so forth. So that's
and the other thing is that the Justice Department accuses Apple of blocking vendors and vendors who created apps to go around Apple's ability to mess with the consumer. They also block them. So that's what we're saying here really in the conversation is Apple appears to have behaved in a way that's monopolistic and that stifles competition unfairly due to their own size now in the marketplace. And so
let me give a little meat on the bones of what you just said real quick. Like this, just an example of that. And I know that with the Fortnite thing, there's a big dispute with Apple and all of this ongoing right now. And that we're not going to go into that, but just the idea like where Apple, for example, when you pay for things through the App Store, they take a piece of that. And so Apple has taken steps historically to make it so that you have to do everything through the App Store. You can't. If vendors try to go around that and say, okay, no, you just come to our website, you can pay us and directly, you don't have to pay us through the App Store. Apple's trying to shut that down because they want to take a piece of every hit that somebody's going to get if somebody's doing something on their iPhone and so forth. So it is using their market power and their dominance because there's so many people have iPhones that people want to be in the App Store. And so it's like, oh, well, you're just going to have to give Apple, X% of all of your sales because if you want into that market. So that's just an example of what you mean as far as the kind of, like how they will punish you if you try to get around what they've set up in place to take a piece of everything that you're doing.
Yeah, and I think that's where also it's much more difficult for us to see into that ecosystem because it's not big ships, it's not people pulling oil out of the ground and all that. It's all in our smartphone everything's at lightning quick speeds. And, I don't really know what's going on behind the scenes and like you're saying about apps and vendors and who's paying who what. And so to me, let me just finish this this is an example because I thought about like, it's interesting that the Justice Department, this is the system, right? Apple is getting sued. Now, a court of law is going to go through due process, and we'll see if the Justice Department's claims are founded or unfounded once we have discovery and all that. So again, this speaks to the strength of the American system, that the government doesn't just throw a hammer at a large corporation because it doesn't like it. This is a process. And as we've explained, the Justice Department has brought some evidence that appears, worth looking into. That Apple is behaving a certain way.
That's a key point, man. Because I like Apple, but I mean,
I'm a consumer of it. I've got an iPhone, iPad. I've got my whole family 10 years worth of pictures or more on iCloud that I pay for. Yeah, so I'm a
you better watch those pictures, man. You out here doing a show talking about how Apple might need to get the hand slap or wrist slap. But no, I mean, I think that's an excellent point, though, in the sense that this isn't about liking or not liking Apple. Like this is the law of the land, and these laws are in place because it's been determined previously. People learn lessons in the past. We're wise to kind of take heed of those lessons that one company or a small group of companies dominating markets is not good for innovation. It's not good for consumers. You get less quality, you get higher prices and so forth. So that's the exercise that's going on here. This is in order to this is pro-business in the sense of, hey, we need to be able to make sure that new businesses can even come up, and then we also have to make sure that consumers are getting a fair deal. Well, how do you do that without the government constantly holding everybody's hand? You create a competitive marketplace. That's the way it does. And then the competitive marketplace does that work. So the other thing, though, that I wanted to get into and just briefly mention is like Apple, and then I've seen it referred to as like a walled garden approach. And so Apple's saying their point is that, hey, we're increasing ease of use for consumers. We're helping consumers in that way. We're increasing security, because we vet everything so closely that comes through the App Store and things have to be approved. And we're making sure that it's safe and everything like that. That's their argument. They're not saying, they do have counter arguments to this, and they have, other ones, but just they have these counter arguments. And so the question ultimately and to your point, the government isn't just unilaterally saying, okay, here's what we're going to do. This has to go through the court system, which is going to take a lot of time. We know how that goes. It's going to take a lot of time. And in many cases in the past, companies and the government have come to settlements. They agree, okay, well, here's what we'll do. This is what will resolve this issue. And that may be something that happens here. It may not. Apple may take this all the way to trial and appeals and all that and try to just say that the government's wrong in terms of this isn't a violation of the law. But ultimately, this is, I think, to your point, a strength of our system is that, okay, we have these rules in place to promote this greater good. And now the government, they've gotten off their hand. This is kind of like, with Apple right now, it's almost like Apple's the guy, everybody's going, all these big businesses are going 85 and a 65. And the government pulled over Apple. They're probably like, yo, everybody's doing this. Everybody's trying to lock people into these closed ecosystems and all that. But hey, like you are too. So, yeah, everybody else was zooming by. The cop pulled you over. So, this is what you're going to have to deal with it. And then we'll see what comes of it. I do want to throw a quick.
Hold on, I just want to joke. I'm thinking about it's like taking classified documents home. Like, man, everyone does it. How come I'm getting hammered? It's that guy over there. Sorry, I couldn't resist. I was just thinking about it.
You couldn't resist.
Everybody's doing it.
I'm walking away from now, and I'm walking away from now.
Go ahead. Keep going.
I do want to make a brief reference though to because I said Apple being a serial violator in terms of antitrust. Like their whole get down definitely does seem to kind of run afoul of antitrust ethos, and so the EU has been ahead of the US on this and been more aggressive in terms of this. Like even recently, I don't know if people have noticed a switch where iPhones now, I think the most recent release from 2023 of the iPhone, maybe 15 it was, has a USB-C and it doesn't have Lightning anymore. And that's in a direct response to the EU a few years back saying, hey, we don't want all consumers to have to do all these different chargers. So, the USB-C is comparable to what you use from a technological standpoint, maybe even better. So, you're going to have to switch over to that in the European Union. And Apple's like, well, if we got to switch it there, we're going to switch it everywhere. We're not going to be doing both. And so that's something that the EU has done. So just for context, was there anything that either for context or just to add on to this discussion, anything notable from what you see as far as the EU? And that was one example, but just how the EU has already kind of been going at Apple for this. And, and I know that they even passed a new law recently, which we'll touch on briefly, but just in terms of trying to scale back the exercise of monopoly power, by Apple and other tech giants.
Yeah, it's interesting because they did come out with something that's called the Digital Markets Act.
Yeah, recently.
A few weeks ago. I mean, we're here, like you said, March 26th. This thing, I think, came out at the beginning of March. Yeah. And Apple's already was one of the first targets. So I guess it's multiple governments are looking at Apple. Yeah. And it was they were hit with a $2 billion fine for, their system and platform kind of stealthily promoting Apple Music and not allowing Spotify and other providers of music services and I guess streaming entertainment, certain types, to have the same type of access on the platform and the same type of user experience. And so, it's interesting. I think we've talked about this in other areas with the European Union, the areas like food, that American corporations are just, I think there's 140 something chemicals that if an American corporation like McDonald's or Burger King or others or a Morton Steakhouse wants to do business in Europe, they're just not allowed to put certain chemicals and process food a certain way in order to sell that food in Europe. And maybe this is what happens with Apple, right? That in order, and maybe the other big, because to be fair to Apple, the EU is heavily targeting Google and Meta as well with this digital market.
Just to be clear, though, this thing, it's not like the TikTok thing where they wrote a law naming these companies. Specifically, what it is they're looking at big tech, quote unquote, gatekeeper companies that provide, and this is another quote, core platform services. And so, and they even say like they're trying to break up closed tech ecosystems that lock customers in. As I said, that's Apple's get down, but Facebook, Google's, they're all trying to do that stuff too. Like that's how you monetize people, monetize people more efficiently. And so, but obviously that is something that regulators and the people who have looked closely at this thing is something that stifles competition and also ultimately is not good for consumers and for businesses by and large, other than the business obviously
and that's where I'm getting at is the fact that the EU forces American food corporations to behave differently when selling products over there in that continent, unfortunately doesn't translate to their behavior at home where they're offering us as Americans better food. And so that's what I'm saying is we might see a similar just evolution in the tech ecosystem and big company space where, maybe these big companies start playing ball just to make sure they have access to the European market and behave in the way that the European Union is asking. And they won't behave that way domestically because our government won't ask the same of them. And it's interesting. It's just, I think it speaks a lot to the power of American corporations' ability to lobby their government. And that because I can get into the tangent on pharmaceutical drugs and why, in Canada, they're much less than our own companies sell to Americans. And that's all because of the way that these
the legal and regulatory framework that's in
for
place
the consumer, though. Yeah,
exactly.
So
let me add to that. It's an interesting point about how the food, like the EU has these stricter regulations on food and what can go in it and so forth. And so the same burger that's sold by a multinational fast food company, the same burger that's sold in the European Union will have different ingredients than the burger that's sold in the United States because of that. In the tech space, it's interesting to me because for a hardware concern like the USB-C charging port, that's a much more difficult needle to thread for them to have to use one charging port for iPhones here and another one there. Just the economy, they lose so much on the economies of scale as far as their production and so forth. But from a software standpoint, to your point, it wouldn't be very difficult at all, relatively, to have hey, we're going to take this much data from consumers in the European Union. We're going to store it. It'll be very minimal, but in the U.S., we're going to take everything from them and we're going to keep it forever. It wouldn't be very difficult to treat customers or treat people differently in the U.S. versus or even how the App Store works or how the music systems work. All of those things it wouldn't be that difficult based on your IP address, where you're accessing it from, how the app treats you or what the app allows you to do or doesn't allow you to do. So yeah, that we could be in line if our government doesn't pick it up in terms of making sure that the protections are in place for things that are deemed anti-competitive or exploitations of the market. Then yeah, we may end up where it bifurcates and Europe has a different experience than us, and and so forth in terms of how the tech environment treats them and how the markets are receptive to competition, versus, or locking people into closed ecosystems.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, keep it moving though. Like I said, I just wanted a brief comment on the Europe piece, because Europe being so far ahead of us in terms of how aggressively they are trying to push these companies is interesting, at the minimum. And I think you probably got to the root of it with the lobbying piece. But the lobbying piece defines a lot of this. I wanted to discuss just briefly with you the historical context, because a lot of us, not all of us, but a lot of us, when we learn about monopolies and American history and so forth, you hear about Standard Oil or then even, AT&T, like these big breakups of companies. Now, breakup isn't the only remedy. And a lot of times that's the most extreme remedy. But how do you look at this in terms of the context? Or do you see any context that's helpful in terms of what happened, like with Standard Oil or AT&T or any other, major antitrust enforcement action from the past in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think it's a good question because, your allusion to Ford in that example earlier was a good example, because that's kind of what Standard Oil really did at the time. And for the audience, just to do a quick, reflection, Standard Oil was the company founded by John D. Rockefeller in the late 1800s, which became quickly the largest company in the world. And
well, initially, a key piece on this, initially, they were really good. They had a competitive advantage by being really good at what they were doing. And then they leveraged that to go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting comparison, I think, to Apple. And I think Apple can be representative of maybe this basket of, like you say, gateway companies that have come up on the tech side as comparison to Standard Oil. Because think about it, Standard Oil in the 1870s, 1880s, were basically just starting the industrial age, within the prior decades. And we're coming from the world being totally agrarian to this new thing called oil, which can power engines and change the world. Literally.
It's literally the transition from coal and steam power to this new, to oil, and the ability to use that to start powering, to start, as an energy source for all these things that we're doing. Yeah.
And I think even the oil part gets lost on the bigger idea of petroleum creating literally new products. Think about it, plastic, rubber, those things never existed on the earth before. And so now we have,
rubber, but synthetic rubbers,
Okay, I'm not talking about molasses that falls out of a tree.
I mean latex. Latex,
so,
yeah.
So yeah,
I didn't want anybody walk away.
Well, if you're going to challenge me on some nerd stuff, then I'm going to make you go. So yeah, so let's not go down that road, because we will.
But that'll be a 10-minute diversion into nowhere. But
exactly. But the idea is just that, and that's why I say the analogy to me is comparable, because if we say all that, right, from the late 1800s, we could say, hey, by the late 90s, the early 2000s, this new thing called the internet created this whole new, realities, right? I mean, who ever heard of email and the @ sign and all this kind of stuff prior to 25, 30 years ago? And so we now have a whole new thing. And so I think that if you look at, just to read a little bit of what Standard Oil was accused of, a quote from an article: Standard Oil allegedly used its size and clout to undercut competitors in a number of ways that were considered anti-competitive, including underpricing and threats to suppliers and distributors who did business with Standard's competitors. So that's what I mean by they were more like a gangster, kind of like the way Apple's behaving. I would say more so than the comparison of AT&T, which is, people our age and older are pretty familiar with that, because that one was broken up in 1982, which was basically just the breakup of what were called the Bell operating companies, which to me wasn't as much of a sinister, malicious thing like a monopolistic takeover as I think it was just organic. That you had AT&T and Bell, companies from the 1920s and 30s that were the only ones doing this stuff. 50 years later, they were still the only ones doing this, and the Justice Department said, "You know what? We're just going to break you guys up just to get
Well, actually, that AT&T, they were going to lose the lawsuit, the antitrust lawsuit, and AT&T proposed that because just for a little clarity, AT&T, as you pointed out, I think, and that the organic development, like it in the 20s, it didn't make sense to have 50 different companies, laying these wires and so forth. There was hey, let's get a network set up. So it made sense to have, maybe one group or a collection of companies doing that, and maybe all under one ownership. But AT&T at that time was providing all the local coverage, all the long distance service, all the local service, all the long distance service, and they were their own equipment supplier. So it was like, okay, guys, like that again is where you get out of beyond just the core business. You start being also all of the ancillary businesses that come along with this, or being, having your hand in that pot. And then they suggested this consent judgment, basically saying, hey, well, we'll cleave off the local stuff. We still get to do long distance, and then the local people won't have to buy from our equipment company. But yeah, I think that was different, because what Standard Oil did was they got good in one thing and then started going upstream and downstream, and then started saying, hey, all right, we're going to dominate the next level up from us, the next business up from us, the next business down from us, and keep going. And that is similar, I think, similar to to what we see at Apple. But I think what we know now, though, is that the breakup is, in the last 40, 50 years has been seen as more extreme, so we're not like we've heard, in the passing calls to break up Facebook, or calls to even now, like, oh, is Apple are they going to try to break up Apple and so forth? The government doesn't seem to like that anymore, as much anymore. And really there is a line of demarcation you can point to in the late 70s and 80s where, Robert Bork was very influential in this, and Ronald Reagan took a lot of his advice in terms of this stuff, where the government kind of became like they did kind of look and say, okay, we don't need to be as aggressive with protecting competitors, and like making sure that we protect the marketplace. Like a big company might be able to just serve everybody just fine. And it represented a departure in terms of how aggressively our government enforced this stuff. And it's not a coincidence now that, you go from city to city, town to town, and it all, these shopping centers may all look the same because you got the same big companies doing everything. It's been a conscious decision, is my only point. And, we may see now, there may be some reversal against this, because this does, every time this leads to greater concentration of wealth. And what happens a lot of times, and this will transition us into this next part. A lot of times what happens with this is, once you have too many parties become so entrenched, they resist change instead of driving innovation. If something's happening, it's like, oh, we want to keep things the same. We're going to box out anybody who's trying to change anything or who's trying to innovate, because we like the way things are now are very profitable for us. So it doesn't drive innovation. And then obviously they're able to charge higher prices. Even right now, like the government's looking at the grocery industry, like there's been questions on whether or not like their profits and their margins are up as high as the pandemic still. And it's like, well, hold on, the pandemic's over. What's going on? So just on that last piece, like antitrust generally in the United States as it stands today, like in context of the past or not, like what are you noticing, and in terms of, well, one, just your thought on antitrust, and if it's been, if it's something the government should be focusing on, and then two, what are you noticing as far as recent trends? And, and is this something based on what you think about the first question, do you think this is a good trend or a bad trend?
I'm not sure on trends yet. Probably have to look a little bit deeper to see.
Probably a longer time frame.
Yeah, like a longer view is let's say is the last 5-6 years, is there more antitrust activity than there were in the prior 20 years? I mean, it seems like probably no. I think this Apple and this kind of big tech stuff is not unique, but it's something everyone's been kind of talking about, has been on their minds. And I think we're not surprised after, especially, even conversations we've done on the show about the negative effects of social media on young people and all this. We know that and we live in Florida, and I think the governor just passed legislation this week about social media and kids, that they're going to try and ban, I guess, people under a certain age from even getting on social media apps. So the idea that the government would scrutinize this specific big tech stuff is not a surprise to me. I think what's interesting, to your point about the grocery store stuff, I'm preparing for today. I just saw interesting articles. The grocery stores is one. Another one which I found interesting, and just for honorable mention, is there's an antitrust suit against Hermes, the Birkin bag maker. Those $100,000 bags, because again, they're apparently stifling the market and competition in certain ways. So it just was interesting to me to see that kind of variety of antitrust kind of activity going on right now. And it was a reminder to me that, again, going back to the way we discussed this in the opening part of this discussion, not that the government's targeting companies like the way it appears to, the government, and I mean the government here, not the deep state, what people think, but I'm talking like people in the open, like the senators and Congress people that appear to be targeting TikTok. That appears to be a target. This is what appears to be the government, in my opinion, doing what it's supposed to do to protect the consumer in making sure that there is a level playing field in the marketplace. And I think it's no coincidence to me, going back to the Standard Oil conversation that we had, the outsized gains of wealth of people, a concentrated group of people like Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan, Henry Flagler, who also were business partners. And then you had the antitrust era coming over the ensuing decades, which also helped to lead to things like the New Deal, the biggest middle class and all that, because you had a more level playing field and the ability for entrepreneurs and small business people to have a chance and grow in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And then to your point, starting about 45 years ago, we had new silent attacks on the regulatory system coming from the industrialist crowd that does the lobbying. And I think today it's not a surprise that the new technology, like we've discussed, with a weak regulatory environment like we had in the middle to late 1800s after the Civil War, that we then have this outsized group of people that, like we talked about in a private conversation recently, Elon Musk is worth now like $208 billion. And it was like 5 years ago, he was worth $100 billion. You know what I mean? And I'm not hating on a guy for being wealthy. I'm just saying that this group at the top has become even more exponentially wealthy in just recent, like the last half decade. People, like, it used to be, there was nobody worth $100 billion 10 years ago. And now we have multiple, like a dozen people worth that much. So it's just, it's not a surprise that this has all got us back into a similar place, that history has rhymed. Maybe not repeated, but it's rhyming.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent point. And also in the sense that it seems to be bringing the issue to a head again to the populace. Yeah. Like, okay, now that, we have this concentration of wealth and power that is becoming so extreme that it's impossible to ignore, then it's going to bring the issue back to a head. And so that's probably the natural ebb and flow. To me, I think it's too early to say whether this is a trend. This could be something, though. If this signals a more sustained, more aggressive, this is a big swing, I think, is the biggest way or the best way to look at this. This isn't something on the margins here. This is one of the biggest companies in the world, and you're going at one of their core ways of the way they do business, and that they're open about how they do business. When we were preparing for the show, you were talking about how, Tim Cook cracks a joke. When somebody's complaining to him about, this doesn't work well, when somebody's in an Android environment or whatever, he's like, tell the person to buy an iPhone. And it's like, yo, man, hold up. You shouldn't be making that. The government cites that, in their antitrust report. This is like, and so, it's getting to the point where, it's going to force the public's hand to deal with this stuff with the laws that are already in the books. And if that's a key piece here, is that with the TikTok thing, while we are skeptical of TikTok and ByteDance and all that, we were more skeptical of the government singling them out legislatively. Like, all right, we're going to make a law about this person. Like, hold on, what's the problem? Let's make a law and apply that to everybody. Whatever the problem is, let's address that problem in a law that applies to everybody, not making a law about one person. And in this case, that's what we want to see is the laws are already on the books. It's just a matter of there's been lax enforcement or the government takes small swings. So this is a big swing. I mean, government's taken swings, in the past, 20 years ago, they took a swing at Microsoft and, that didn't play out the way necessarily that the government wanted. But nonetheless, like the government's taken some swings and, but this is a big one. So we'll see if this signals a return to a more robust kind of business environment where, some say, people look at these numbers, they're talking about how like there were more publicly traded companies back in the 70s and so forth than there are now.
Definitely.
And it's like, well, so we have a lot more people, a lot more business, but less companies. Like, what does that say? Like I said, we're going in a
well, it's like you said, when I was a kid, I mean, growing up in, Washington, D.C. area, we used to have hardware stores, a lot of like in the early mid 80s. And they slowly got replaced by Home Depots and Lowe's. And I think that's an easy example for Walmart, for the public, and the little local grocery stores have been replaced by the regional big players and the super Walmarts and all that and the Target grocery stores. So, this idea,
to your point, it's the government's job if that is something that violates the laws on the books, and the laws on the books are in place to protect the consumers and to protect people claim to love free markets and markets. We got to protect markets. Markets don't exist in nature. One person takes it all over and it's just theirs. So it requires big government and big government intervention to protect the market. We learned that lesson already. We learned that 150 years ago. So now that government's doing that action to preserve the market and to ensure a good environment for a worthy environment for consumers. And so that's what we're in right now. And so we'll see. And then the point isn't to stake an emotional, connection like, oh, this is terrible because of this, or this is great because this is just like, all right, well, let's see how it plays out. But it's notable in the sense, like I said, the government, I don't know that you'd say that the government were taking this big a swing at a core at such a big company, like at least consistently more recently. And now, like looking at Walmart, they're looking at Kroger's and the grocery industry and all that. So yeah, I mean, we'll see if this is different, but it is good. It's good to see that the people who are supposed to be looking at this stuff are actually looking at this stuff and they're not afraid to take a swing.
Yeah. And I want to just allude to one thing before we wrap this section up, to something you said about those who get big end up being more interested in protecting their own interests and all that. One thing would be the electric car market. It's well documented that, as early as the 1980s, 1990s, there were designs of electric cars that looked very functional.
It could be viable.
Could have been, And we're fortunate that we had a guy that already made $1 billion in something called PayPal that by the early 2000s.
Back up. Yeah. But those designs were buried because there was the big auto and big oil. There were few players, and they were kind of cozy enough that it's like, hey, we don't necessarily need to. If big auto starts doing electric cars, that's going to mess with big oil, So it's like, hey, we'll kind of keep everything. So there weren't enough diversity in players for someone to take that swing, and so,
Well, no, and that's where I think we're kind of fortunate as a society that a guy that was able to make a lot of money prior to, Elon Musk, and also partnered with the federal government in 2009 through a $500 million grant, that we had this person that was willing to take this risk and it worked out. Right. And we have now the Tesla, which is the proof of concept. So I think,
which then once the concept was proved, proof of concept, then everybody else jumps in. So now there's a bunch of competition and there's a bunch of innovation. And each year they're pushing the envelope.
Also, that's a good point. The competition is pushing the new technology. So now we have better battery life and use for a lot of things. And we got houses powered on batteries, but also now they're working on the hydrogen engine. And it's just so this innovation pushes new innovation. And it's kind of like, without an MP3 player, maybe we don't get to Bluetooth technology. So even though some things may not seem related, they all persist. But I'll just finish here with the idea that this is a very American thing. The Sherman Act, when it was enacted, the Supreme Court called it a Charter of Freedom that was designed to protect free enterprise in America. And this is something very American, as I'll read from Justice Douglas in the United States versus Columbia Steel. At the very end of his whole tirade, he says, it is founded on a theory of, meaning the Sherman Act, is founded on a theory of hostility to the concentration in private hands of power so great that only a government of the people should have it. that's a very American spirited thing to say, as we were founded off a country that didn't want a king anymore.
Yeah.
So I just want to say that antitrust is really part of the lifeblood.
I would say
of
at least traditionalist American, because there are a lot of Americans now that don't seem to have lost connection to that,
that's another show.
Well, no, but no, I mean, it's a good point, and I'm glad you did finish with that, because that's an excellent kind of context in terms of because again, this stuff doesn't exist. This stuff wasn't happening in the 1700s or anything like that. Like, this is the kind of stuff that when you're trying to have this dynamic society where there are multiple players and not just a select group of winners that get to be forever winners in business. This is the kind of thing that you need to have in order to make that vision come true. So I think we can wrap from there. Thanks for joining us on part 1 of this discussion. Part 2 of this week will be coming up, so please check for that as well.